결혼 성주 상계 지선만 사단이 다들 가수 못도가 제와 못도가 되게
So of course the motivation that we should bring about is one to establish all beings in the awakening of Buddhahood. With this motivation we should set out to listen to the Dharma teachings, and in particular at this point now familiarize ourselves with the fact of impermanence. We continue with the words of Gampopa, and he says, since the very beginning of the world, since the world has formed, all humans who have lived in this world have been afraid of death. Yet not a single one has found a way to avoid it. And he continues to say, there isn't a single one who has survived death and has remained alive. And this is how it is. All of those who have been born into this world eventually do die. How do we define death? While alive, we exhale, and of course, eventually we inhale again. But then occasionally it comes to pass that there is a rather large gap between our last exhalation and our next inhalation. That is commonly known as death.
Gampopa. One of the main students of the great master of yogis, Milarepa, was, as we all know, the great incomparable Gampopa. And after he had studied, practiced for a while under Milarepa, Milarepa called him into his presence and said to him, "You have now heard everything that I have to say. You have received everything I have to teach, and you have practiced, you have realized it. Therefore, it is now time for you to go and start your own activities. Go to the Gampopa mountain. You will meet there with students who have a previous connection with you, and you will benefit them, and you will teach the Dharma." Gampopa did as he was told by Milarepa. He went there, and eventually a large number of students gathered around him. And at some time or other, one of his students, of Gampopa's students, asked Gampopa, how vast exactly is your realization? And Gampopa answered, my realization is as vast as space. Whether or not I breathe, whether or not I exhale and inhale, it's all the same. Which means to say that he had achieved this realization in which, as it said, breath or wind and mind or awareness for that matter have become one and the same. In such a realization, with such a realization, one is utterly free to breathe or not breathe, to inhale and exhale or not to do so. And this realization, this accomplishment, is for the most part known as the accomplishment of the city of long life. Now, for those of us who are not in possession of a particular practice or a particular training of such a sort, we do not have such a choice whether to breathe or not to breathe. And that means to say that eventually we are all subject to death. Needless to say, all of us rather more ordinary beings would be well advised to familiarize ourselves with the idea of death, permanence for that matter. And accordingly, Chapter says, in the first line of the next verse, look around yourself and count those among those whom you have known who have died. So among all of these people whom we have known, invariably there will be some who have died. We could count them, we could enumerate them, and we could come to see that indeed people do die. There is nothing to be denied about it. So in this way, by way of examining just among those whom we have known, just among our own circle of acquaintances, friends, relatives, whatever, it is a useful thing to just look around and remind oneself of how many of them have already died. Also you, or you too, are in no way better than those who have died last year, or those who have died this year. So we're again called upon by Chapter to look around ourselves, around the circle of people whom we know, whom we have met, simply to examine who among them have died last year and within the course of this particular year. And he points out quite clearly that this same fate is eventually in store for us because we are in no way superior to them. Eventually we will die as they have. Dharma continues to say, even though you know you will die, you will still need the Dharma at that time, when death comes. And even though everybody knows that, they prefer to believe that they have lots of time. This is exactly how we could also characterize ourselves. Yes, we have heard of these teachings of death and impermanence, and yes, we say they're also true. But when it comes to ourselves, we think like, oh, there's lots of time. I don't need to sit down and practice right now. I won't die tomorrow or the day after. I have lots and lots of time at my disposal. Thinking like this, for the most part, death will come all of a sudden. And when death is upon you, well, then there is no more time for practice. In this way, we deceive ourselves. Even though we have heard these teachings, even though we have understood these teachings, we still believe that for ourselves, there is still plenty of time, and therefore we put off practice and put it off until eventually we're overtaken by death. And Gampopa again, reminding us of the same fact, continues to say that it is said that in this particular time or age of ours, we have aged already, or we have become old already, turned old already at age 40. And he again asks us to think of the many people who have died already, either at such an age, at the same age at which we find ourselves now, or even at a younger age. Now it is taught in scripture that in previous times and previous ages, beings had the great fortune to be able to live for many hundreds of years before they died. Then eventually the merit of beings was exhausted and lifespan became shorter, and there was a time when beings lived for 100 years, and then only for 60 or 70 years or whatever. And it is said that generally speaking, if one would look in a very general way presently, we found ourselves at the time when age 40, at least in some parts of the world, already is a ripe old age. This is when our teeth begin to fall out, and we look like old people, even though only at 40 years of age. And of course, sooner or later, after that, death will be upon these people, will be upon us for that matter. So yet again, by way of this analogy, we're being told to contemplate the fact that death will sooner or later, but for sure, eventually be upon us. Well, even though all of this is indisputably so, we still disregard these facts completely. We all have heard of the teachings of death and impermanence. We all know that people, beings for that matter, die constantly. We just need to look around ourselves and see that this is the case. yet in regard to our own self, we, for whatever reason, prefer to believe that death, yes, even though it will eventually be upon us, will not come just now. We won't die. Not yet. That is our firm belief for whatever reason, even though there is no ground to believe so whatsoever. And believing so, erroneously, totally mistakenly, we do all sorts of useless things. We create all sorts of negativity because we have this idea that we have to vanquish our enemies, that we have to protect our friends, that we have to establish families, etc., and so forth. So under this erroneous impression of death coming for everybody else, but not yet for us, we do all of these things which for the most part are, of course, a waste of time. But then, eventually, quite unannounced and quite unexpected, surprise, surprise, death knocks at our door, and there we are. All of a sudden things are all too real, all of a sudden it is the time for us to die, and then nothing is of no avail whatsoever. So for whatever reason it might be, we believe that death will not just come for us right now, whereas he's happily free to do so for everybody else. Gampopa continues to advise us by way of saying, you are none other, you are no different than all of the others. Because this is so, because even though you choose to believe it is otherwise, death will be upon you as unexpectedly as upon everybody else. Therefore, the only thing that makes sense is to familiarize yourself with, to practice the Dharma. Therefore, of course, it goes without saying what time is left, because no one knows how much it is. We would be well advised to learn and practice the Dharma before it is too late, before death comes to wrench us away. In this way, Gampopa tells us time and again to consider impermanence and death, and thoroughly familiarize yourself with this idea. And he continues to say that in the text that this is the very method for those who have not entered the Dharma to do so. It is also the method for those who have entered the Dharma to reach its conclusion or to further traverse the path of the Dharma. So for those of us who have not yet, for those who have not yet truly entered the Dharma, to contemplate death and impermanence and to truly understand that sooner or later we will indeed all die, this could in turn cause an understanding in us of the importance of Dharma, of the necessity of familiarizing ourselves with Dharma by way of learning it, by way of putting it into practice. Then there are those who have already entered
upon the path of the Dharma, yet are in not too much of a great hurry to traverse that path. Those who think, yes indeed, I have received the Holy Dharma and I have to practice it, but I could do so tomorrow, or I could do so next week. Some may think maybe next year there's also still enough time to practice the Dharma, to put it into practice, to truly familiarize myself with it. Also, those could, of course, eventually be overcome by death, and then, needless to say, there will be no more time to do any Dharma practice, any study. So in this way, familiarizing yourself with the inevitability of death and the fact that it is in no way that no one can say when death will be upon you, for that matter. That is the method, is one of the most efficient methods of getting us into the Dharma, and once in the Dharma, of spurring us on towards doing more practice, more study of the Dharma, to bring the Dharma, as it says in the text, to bring it to its conclusion. And accordingly, Dharma concludes this verse by way of saying, from the bottom of your heart, remembering death, that is a profound instruction, or is a profound Dharma teaching. So to truly familiarize yourself with the inevitability of death, etc., and so forth, is that which spurs us on our path. It's that which becomes the driving force behind our Dharma practice. It is that which, in the first place, brings us into the Dharma. It is that which allows us to continue on the path of the Dharma, not to rest too much, but to actually use what time we have to do whatever Dharma activity it is, study or practice. And it is that which also allows us to eventually bring this path to a conclusion, to speak with the words of the previous line, to perfect the Dharma to such an extent that we bring about some realization and correspondingly some liberation through the Dharma. So therefore, to remember death from the bottom of your heart, to in your innermost heart remind yourself of death, that Gampopa considers to be a most profound teaching.
I think myself, Tom Susi, Chesap Lundroko, Joatane Martin Bagay, and two songs, Roba, Rasoba, Sego, Song, and Young, the Tang, Maran, Yandot, Marana, and in Nepal, good and that, Chido. And in Matonzi, Granada. 대파도 이지 용을 비치 전지계란 로를 저와타네 마진네 양이지 대선저와 년의 랭성도 년나세에 전년 마사주스 점진대에서나 저와도저도 니마레라 팀마스는 다는 대인거리 나라 시행거리 하나 주명 지고 올라서 된다고 대인거 대다되는 되는 제 템버스가 되라 에미 삼육의 그 강아랑서 생기 주라 제바 주념서 레이터바 된다고 그 담아 쳇바지
And on it goes, saying, if death does not pierce your heart, remembrance of death does not pierce your heart, even though you might practice the Dharma, it will degenerate into a method for furthering the aims of this life. So if we would not remember death and impermanence in such a way that it becomes a cause for us to strengthen, to invigorate our study and our practice of the Dharma, we might well fall under the mistaken idea that Dharma is a method through which we become more famous, through which we become more influential. We think people might think us to be a great Dharma practitioner, therefore have devotion to us, etc. and so forth. So in this way, what should be true Dharma practice, it only degenerates into a method for furthering our influence or fame or whatever. Therefore, Kamachagna advises us that it is the most profound Dharma instruction to think of death 3 times a day in such a way that it truly pierces our hearts, that truly from the very bottom of our hearts we have understood the significance of death and impermanence, and that we do not allow ourselves to go astray and let our Dharma practice, our Dharma study degenerate into something that merely brings about some temporary benefits for this lifetime. And this chapter of the song is concluded then simply with the line saying, this was the song or teaching chapter on death and impermanence, and cause and effect. Now all of us, of course, it goes without saying, greatly motivated to learn, to study, to practice the Dharma now, aren't we? However, the very essence of all of our concerning ourselves with the Dharma is to come to understand, to realize mind nature itself. The very nature of that stream of consciousness of ours that we call mind is to be recognized. That is the essence, that's the most important point of all of our concerning ourselves with Dharma in whichever way. Since time without beginning, we have been born again and again within the cycle of suffering that is commonly known as samsara. And there's no way that we could pinpoint when this has started. Since that is the case, since we have time and again been reborn in this cycle of suffering, we have always thought of ourselves as I, me, mine in that regard. And it is this idea, the idea of there being a self, being something that unmistakably identifies ourselves as ourselves, that is the driving force for our having again and again been reborn in this cycle of suffering, within samsara. If we were to examine that thing which we hold to be a truly existent self, we would invariably come to the conclusion that there is no such thing, but having so far failed to do so conclusively, we continue to believe that there is such a thing. This mistaken, erroneous idea of ours that there is such a thing as a self, or ego, or an I, whatever you wish to call it, that is the driving force behind our continuously being reborn. And that ignorance, that mistake of ours to believe in the existence of that thing, of self or whatever, that is what's called ignorance. We are under the influence of ignorance, under the influence of not knowing how things truly are, how we truly are. Therefore we believe there to be such a thing as a self. We cling to this self, which is the driving force for our continuous rebirth within samsara.
年木个刀把汤子，人刀把汤子给谁哩没谁吧？人汤子去后个工作搞出去了。
The only way to eradicate this mistaken, this erroneous idea of there being a self with everything that we tag on to this idea is to develop the recognition or the awareness that there where we believe to be a self, there is no such thing. That which we consider to be the self is an utterly non-existent, empty entity which has no self-nature unto itself whatsoever. And once we have developed this awareness, once we have brought about this insight of there being no self where presently we believe there to be one, once that is the case, then all of the various habits and tendencies and all the various things which we do under the influence of believing that there is a self, they will just evaporate. They will dissolve, they will disappear into that which we call Dharmakaya, the manifestation or the body of suchness, truth itself.
还得给告诉人，反正做小农场的山嘛，这是身体里的养大把，我开发是吧？他等于给反正麦浪汤，反正热瓦汤，反正把马桶也让烧完等的，他听着话的，反正养大把的小农场的身体里的我些吧。 做这大一点，俺们从根基，两年是做电影。
So for the duration of this year's summer course, she says, our main focus should be the bringing about of this recognition. Bringing about a recognition that there is no such thing as a self and everything that goes along with it, where we, for the present moment, believe there to be such a thing. To come to recognize it as non-existent, as empty. And in this regard, we will be well advised to address ourselves by way of prayer and supplication to those who constantly dwell in this realization of no self, namely, of course, our root lineage lamas, our Yidam deities, etc.
And the Tenga, our Saint Tonga, and Tava, Sherab, Tava, Yorwa. There are Tazigan around many Tava. The Saint Tonga, and Chu Tonga, Yansun. Sanga Sana Tadu, then Aruk, Sana, Narang, Ripa Yishik, and Naranga Sana, Tava. Many good Tava Yomara. They and do Tanaran, Roma, Santa Roma, Johnny, Naranga, Sana, Ripa Yishik, Naranga, Suji, Taruki.
For the most part, when we speak about looking at things or seeing things, we mean the kind of seeing that happens by way of our eyes. We open our eyes, we look out into the world, we see everything that is in the world, we see all the beings that inhabit this world, etc. This is not how seeing one's mind nature, or seeing mind as it truly is, works. It cannot be seen with our eyes. Rather, we have to learn to allow ourselves to direct our awareness or our focus of attention inwards. And this is simply done by allowing mind or by allowing awareness to simply, uncontrivably rest in its own natural state. This is the way in which we come to understand how mind nature works, for that matter. By simply allowing it to rest uncontrivably in itself without any further ado. The great 19th century Eastern Tibetan master Kenshin Tashi accordingly says to allow mind to look at mind, to allow it to rest there where there is nothing to see. This is how one has to, this is how one should proceed, this is how one should practice. So in the very same way, or in very similar words, he expresses the same meaning here. Simply allow mind or awareness to rest in itself. Do not try to see something that is not to be seen. Simply allow awareness to rest like this naturally, and simply leave it at that. This is the way how to go about this. And in this way, let us now train in this right here and now. Let simply awareness allows simply awareness to rest in itself, to be aware of itself. So when resting like this, we should examine what is it that there is to be seen? What is it that there is to be examined? When we look at mind, allow mind to look at itself like this, then we could eventually analyze as to whether or not it has a shape. Is it maybe square, or is it maybe round? Is it longish or short? Or does it rather more have the quality of color? If so, what color is that awareness of the mind of ours? So in this way, we should clearly examine this awareness that we allow to rest in itself as to whether or not it has any such characteristics. Then again, it could come to pass that mind is recognized as a whole lot of thought activity, as a whole mass of thoughts, coarse and subtle ones. And we could look at these. When these thoughts of whatever nature they might be manifest, then in this particular moment we're called upon to look into the very essence of the thought. What is this thought made up of? Where does it come from? Where does it dwell? Where does it possibly disappear to? Etc. And the more we become aware of the thought, the more we become awake, so to speak, and ever more aware, vividly aware of the thought, the more that comes to be the case, the more efficiently these thoughts simply vanish, simply evaporate or disappear. And when that is the case, then again, we're simply called upon to simply rest in this. Now let us again try this out. Let us again train in exactly this practice. And when it comes to pass that thoughts appear in your mind stream, well, simply look right into the thought and rest in this. When the thought evaporates, when it vanishes, again, just allow yourself to rest in that state. So time is up for today, and we will not have the opportunity for questions today. So if there are any questions, for tomorrow. Rather, we should conclude today's teaching sessions now with whatever merit, with the dedication of whatever merit we might have accumulated in the course of today.